So I have good news and I have bad news. Which do you want first? Do you want the good news or the bad news? Good news or bad news? Good news? Anybody want good news? You know, everyone, who wants bad news first? Bad news first? Yeah. See, every service is like that. Everybody's like, just get it over with. Because if I share the good news first, then you'll be going, oh, there's bad news coming. So it takes away from the good news. But I'll give you the bad news. Bad news first, because it's what you asked for. It's going to get worse. You have no idea how much worse. Winter is coming. The night is falling. The storms are on the horizon. The sea is retreating and the skies are darkening, and it will get worse before it gets better. And we have no idea how much worse it will be. The word you're looking for right now is the word dystopian. Dystopian comes from the Greek dous and topos, which means place, means bad place. Dystopia is the opposite of utopia. You could call it antitopia. Utopia is a perfect place. Dystopia is a bad place, a terrible place. A dystopian vision is of a vision of a terrible future. When I say it will get worse, that is a dystopian point of view. Now, I'm no expert in science fiction. I'm no sci-fi geek. I've never been to Fantastic Fest or Comic-Con, and I have absolutely no intention of dressing up like Spider-Man unless you want to pay me a whole lot of money. $2 a check, and I will preach in a Spider-Man costume. I promise you I'll do it. Somebody wants to write that, I'm preaching as Spider-Man or some cosplay thing. But other than that, that's not my jam. I don't do it. And I was into science fiction when I was young. I mean, I was into Star Trek. I mean, Star Trek was kind of my jam. I mean, I love the misogynistic Captain Kirk, you know, with his chest hair hanging out of his uniform, and that sort of that mess of a crew that he had. You know, he had Scotty, and he had Bones, and he had Chekhov, and he had Uhura, and then, you know, he had Spock. And there were Klingons and aliens and triples, and you know, they could travel at warp speed. It was like, warp factor 5, Mr. Chekhov. Aye, Captain. And zoom, they go through the galaxy. I mean, how great of a world is that, where you can transport people off of planets? You have phasers and communicators and force fields and all these alien people, and it's all kind of cool. And I was into science fiction until Star Trek: The Next Generation came out. And they had all the same toys. They had warp speed. They had the crazy crew. They had all these interesting characters. But then I watched and I thought, the man is bald. They have all of this ability, all of this science, all of this capacity, and they haven't figured out a way to put hair on a bald man's head. That's a future I want no part of. If that's the future of humanity, just count me out. I'm checking out today. If you can travel at light speed, but you can't put hair on this dome, I'm not interested. But as I survey science fiction literature, as I survey sort of the narrative that is often films and stories of science fiction, it's increasingly dark. Science fiction writers are kind of modern day prophets. They look into the future. They kind of postulate, they speculate about what is ahead. It was last week that we began a conversation not about science fiction, but about biblical prophecy, eschatology. We began a consideration of what does the Bible say about the future, and I wanted us to look at 3 unfulfilled prophetic promises. Last week we looked at the first one, the promise of his return. the unfulfilled biblical promise that he, Jesus, will come back to earth. But this week, I want to look at the second promise. And I'm going to go dark. Because the second promise is that night is coming. And that the storm is forming. And the second promise is the promise of tribulation and suffering. It is the promise that it will get worse before it gets better. And I'm sharing that with you now as a warning, because if you're here and you have your children here on a Sunday morning, and that's a good thing, we love it that you have children here to worship with you, but the reality is we're going from PG-13 flying past R, we're going all the way to TVMA today. We're talking adult situations, adult language, adult content. So if that's a little too heavy for your kids, or if it's too heavy for you, in just a moment when I pray, you can politely excuse yourself. Go out, check out the children's ministry, check out the playground, have a cup of coffee. You'll be fine. If the rapture happens and you're standing before Jesus and he says, "Hey, why weren't you in church?" You can say, "Dave told us not to be." But today we are going to talk about the darkness in our future, the storm on the horizon. And the reality is, it will get worse before it gets better. And it will be worse than we can imagine. But before we talk about that, would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, and that you would use your words spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to challenge our hearts, to look past the dark, to the hope, to the light, to the promise that it will get better. Pray that even as we examine the darkness, that we would hold on to in our hearts the light of hope. Pray that for myself and for my family and for every one of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. If you grew up in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, you grew up under the shadow of the possibility of nuclear annihilation. My generation is the first generation in human history to live under the cloud of the reality that we as human beings had created sufficient destructive weaponry that we could end life on this planet as we know it. And we grew up with the reality that given the right kinds of circumstances, that could happen in our lifetime. We grew up with this apocalyptic vision of mutually assured destruction and a nuclear winter and an apocalyptic nightmare of World War III. And living under that cloud, it's not hard for us to imagine a future that is dystopian, a future that is horrifying, a future that is dark. So it's no surprise that that is part of sci-fi messaging, and it has always been a part of the message of the biblical prophets. Even the greatest prophet that ever lived, the one who was really not a prophet, he was just telling the story of human history when he spoke because he was the author of it. Jesus of Nazareth was the greatest prophet who ever lived because he knew the end from the beginning. And even in his prophetic statements, he shows us the darkness that is ahead. In Matthew chapter 24, he is asked a question by his disciples. They're walking through the temple, and it's the last days of his life, and they say, when will these things happen? When will this destruction at the end of the world happen? And what will be the sign of your coming? And what will indicate the end of the age? Jesus then explains to them this vision of the destruction to come. He says to his disciples and to us, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, and then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down and take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back and get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Last week, as we began our conversation about understanding biblical eschatology, I suggested that there's a point of view that the prophet has, that the prophet is looking into the future with a prophetic eye. And what he is seeing, or what they are seeing in their prophecies, are these summits, these future events. But they have no way of telling how far these events are apart. And sometimes they describe these events as sequential. Sometimes they combine them into one event. Sometimes they describe them as being totally different ages, because they don't know. The prophetic view is a person standing looking at a mountain range and not knowing whether this is a ridge on this mountain or this is a ridge on this mountain, or whether there's a giant desert or valley in between the two. And it doesn't matter, because they're saying these are the things that we see in the future. Well, today, if that's not complicated enough, I want to add to the prophet's view the prophet's voice. The prophet's voice is a voice that looks into the future and sees these mountain peaks and describes what will happen to the individuals who are living in each of these ages. The prophet's voice has a personal expression, but it also has a macro expression that covers over all of the things that will happen throughout that time, so that the prophet's voice is both personal and global. It is both universal and individual. And so, as Jesus is talking in Matthew chapter 24, he's talking from a prophet's point of view with a prophet's voice. And he describes the events that will happen in the world. And he says there's one key event that will indicate the end of the age, and he calls it the abomination that causes desolation. And he's pointing back to a prophecy from the prophet Daniel, a prophecy that he had made over 500 years earlier. The story of Daniel. Daniel was an expatriate Jew living in Babylon. In the year 605, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, invaded Jerusalem and destroyed the city. And as was the habit of the Babylonian rulers, they would take trophies, they would take spoils of war, they would take the best and the brightest of their vassal kingdoms, and they would bring them to Babylon, because they believed Babylon was the center of the known world. And they said, we will teach you, we will indoctrinate you in the ways of the Babylonians, in the language and in the culture, in the religion and the science of Babylon. And Daniel was one of these spoils of war. He was one of these trophies that they took back to Babylon in 605 BC. They took him back, if you remember, with 3 of his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or as we used to call them, my shack, your shack, and to bed we go. But those 4 young men, probably young teenagers, were transported into captivity in Babylon, and Daniel, and as far as we know his 3 friends, lived out the rest of their lives in exile in Babylon. Well, 66 years after their capture and their captivity in Babylon, the Babylonian Empire was overrun by the Medo-Persians. The Medo-Persians were led by a king named Darius, the son of Xerxes. And in 539 BC, the Persian Empire overtook the Babylonian Empire. And Daniel had such high standing in the court of the king that he just transferred from one king to another. And he became an immediate advisor in the court of Darius. But Daniel was a student of biblical prophecy, and he had read the writings of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and he made some calculations, and he realized that the exile that he was experiencing was only supposed to last for 70 years, and he had been there 66. And so in Daniel chapter 9, it tells us that he began to pray, and he began to ask God, show me what is in the future for my people. And he showed him in Daniel chapter 9 a vision, the vision that we commonly call the vision of the 77s. And he said that these 77s will be a set of 7 weeks, and a set of 62 weeks, and a set of 1 week. 69 weeks plus a 70th week. And the beginning of that 69 weeks will be when the command is given to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. When your captors allow you to return to Jerusalem and build a secure place for your people, that's when the 69 weeks will begin. Well, we know exactly when that was. It happened 95 years later in the story of a man named Nehemiah. Nehemiah was born into captivity in Babylon, but he was a Jewish individual. He was the cupbearer for the king. He had recently heard from others who had gone back to Jerusalem that Jerusalem was in conflict, that the Jewish people who were trying to resettle in Jerusalem were constantly being persecuted by the people who had inhabited the land after their captivity. Not very different between the Palestinians and Israelis today. Same story, 2,500 years ago. And this so distressed Nehemiah that when he went to present the food to the king, he was the cupbearer to the king, and basically the cupbearer was the food taster. The cupbearer was disposable, because if somebody was going to try and poison the king's food, Nehemiah had to taste it first. So if Nehemiah took a drink of the mead and dropped over dead, the king would go, good thing I didn't drink that, and get a new cupbearer. But that was a trusted position, and it said that Nehemiah goes before the king, Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes notices, you're sad, and he says, I've never been sad before in front of the king, but he noticed, and he said, why would you be so sad unless you're ill? And Nehemiah thought about it for a while, and he said, I'm sad because the land where my ancestors are buried, the city, my home, is lying in ruins. And Artaxerxes said, what do you want? He said, give me permission to get the supplies and the people to go back and rebuild the city of my ancestors, Jerusalem. And on that day, Artaxerxes granted Nehemiah permission to fulfill the prophecy of Daniel. And we know exactly when that day was. Because it was in the month of Nisan, which is the month of March, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, which was 444 BC. And if it was on the first day of Nisan, that meant that it was on March the 5th, 444 BC, that the 69 weeks, the first of the 70 weeks of Daniel, began. Now, you would think that we could easily calculate then, okay, if it's March the 5th, 444 BC, that the 70 weeks began, or the 69 of the 70 weeks began, then we just take 69 times 365, we know how many days that is, or we know how many years that is. And if you do that calculation, 69 weeks of years from March 5th, 444 BC is March 5th, 39 AD. But the problem is those 483 years don't translate because they use different calendars. The Babylonians had a calendar, the Jews had a calendar, there was a solar calendar, which we use, that's 365.24196 something days per year. They had an agrarian calendar, and they had religious calendars. And so calculating how long exactly those 69 weeks were is very difficult. I had a professor in graduate school who had his PhD in biblical chronology from the University of Cambridge in England. And he had written a postdoctoral paper on the 70th week of Daniel. And in that paper, which I have read a half a dozen times trying to figure it out, he does biblical calculus. And I want to raise my hand and go, I got into the ministry because they said there would be no math. But by his calculations, he used the prophetic calendar, and the prophetic calendar in the Hebrew language was a 12-month calendar of 12 30-day months, 360 days. So if you take 69 and you multiply it by 360, you get 173,880 days. Now, the way that he suggested it is that you take that 173,880 days and you lay them over a solar calendar of 365.4 or 0.24196 something days per year. And the date from March the 5th, 444 BC, that is 69 weeks of years later, or 183,880 days later, falls somewhere because of the decimal points in your calculation between the last week of March and the first week of April of 33 AD. The closest calculations he could make said it's the 69th week of Daniel ends somewhere between March 30th, 33 AD, which was a Sunday, and April 3rd, 33 AD, which was a Friday. It just so happens that most biblical historians believe that that week in 33 AD was the Passion Week. That Sunday, March 30th was Palm Sunday, and Friday, April 3rd was the crucifixion. There's two reasons why this matters. Because the prophecy of Daniel predicted that at the end of the 69th week, the anointed one would be cut off. This is what Daniel's prophecy said. After the 62 sevens, after the first 7 weeks of 7, and the 62 sevens, after 69 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue to the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up, what Jesus is referring to in Matthew chapter 24, the abomination that causes desolation, until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. You see, Daniel and Matthew are speaking with the prophet's voice. They're saying, look for these signs in history as the beginning and the end of this end of times, the end of days, the beginning and the end of the 69 weeks of Daniel. And he's looking at it with a prophetic view, so that what Jesus and what Daniel are talking about are an anointed one who's cut off, an abomination that causes desolation, and a ruler that will meet his end. And we're not sure how these all fit together. There are some scholars who believe that the actual fulfillment of the prophecy of the abomination of desolation took place 200 years before Jesus taught this in the temple. It was in 167 BC when a Greek general who proclaimed himself the emperor named Antiochus IV went to war in the Middle East. And he went to war with Egypt, and he lost. And he was so pissed off that he lost his attempt to conquer Egypt that on his way back to Greece, he burned Jerusalem to the ground and killed tens of thousands of Jewish people. And to add insult to injury, Antiochus named himself Antiochus Epiphanes, which means Antiochus, the image of God. And he dedicated the temple in Jerusalem to Zeus and sacrificed an offering to himself on the altar. If you have Jewish friends, you will know the story of Hanukkah. The story of Hanukkah takes place during the rebellion that happened because of the abomination that was desolation that Antiochus Epiphanes carried out in 167 BC. The celebration of lights was part of the restoration of the temple after Antiochus's desecration. There are some people that believe that this was something that already happened when Jesus was talking about it. There are other people who believe that when Jesus was talking about the abomination of desolation, he was talking about something that was going to happen in 27 years. Because in 70 AD, the Romans would push down a Jewish rebellion and destroy Herod's temple, and it has never been rebuilt since. And so there are other scholars who believe that what Jesus is talking about and what the abomination of desolation is it is something that was going to take place 27 years after Jesus was alive, when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. There's another group of people who believe that that hasn't happened yet. The abomination of desolation is something yet future. It's what Paul is talking about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, when he talks about the rise of the man of lawlessness. Paul was writing around the time of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and he saw this as still a future event, a man who would become a global leader. Now, the reality is, from the prophet's point of view, these are three expressions of the same promise. You ask me which of these is right, I say all of them. They were all talking about them. And the reason that this matters is because Jesus knew this. You see, I believe that Jesus knew that he was in the 69th week of Daniel. That the anointed one that Daniel had talked about was him. And that he was walking saying, the 69th week is going to end on Friday. And then that sets the stage for the abomination of desolation and the darkness that is to come. And he knew that that prophecy applied to him. And this is the prophet's eye view. The prophet speaks to these global events, but ultimately, the prophet is identifying events that destroy people's lives. Because cancer is an abomination. The loss of a loved one can lead to an abomination that causes desolation in your life. Financial catastrophe, a failure in business, the failure of your marriage or your family or your friendships are abominations. And the important thing for us to realize is that it's not simply a global prediction of suffering, it's an individual prediction of suffering. Because when your world ends, the world ends for you. When the Roman army invaded your village and killed your father and took your mother captive, your world ended. That was your abomination of desolation. The crucifixion was for Jesus the abomination that causes desolation. What he is saying to us is that there is a storm coming, not just globally, but individually. That all of us in our lifetime will face the darkness. Because the way of our human existence, the narrative of our human story is that we go through the pain to find the victory. The seed has to die and be placed in the ground in order to bring fruit. The sun has to set for it to rise. The tide has to go out for it to come back. And the way of the universe is a way that says you have to go through the darkness to get to the light. That it will get worse before it gets better. And the important thing to realize about this is that it's a guarantee. How do we know that our hope is real? How do we know that there is light beyond this final summit? Because of the promise of this summit. Because of the reality of our suffering, our hope is made secure. Because our hope is as real as our struggle is hard. It is a guarantee. Because the one who authored the narrative of human history, who lays it out for us in pictures and images and prophecies, who tells the story of human history, is also the one who is telling our story. He's also the one who knows our story and holds us in that narrative, so that in the middle of the suffering, in the middle of the darkness, on the summit of suffering, hope is always on the other side. This is what Jesus was talking about in Matthew chapter 24. I believe he's talking about the global abomination of desolation that will mark the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. And I believe he is reminding us that on our life's journey, we will face these abominations that cause desolation. He says, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, not just the one spoken of by Daniel, but the diagnosis of cancer or the loss of a child or the failure of a business, when you see that in your life, let the reader understand your hope, understand that God is directing the narrative, that you aren't finished yet. Then those who are in Judea, flee to the mountains, hightail it out of there, get moving, don't get stuck. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. Make sure you understand what's vitally important. Hold on what you cannot lose and let go of the rest. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers, because there is no suffering like watching your child suffer. There is no darkness that is more frightening than watching someone you love suffer. Pray that it would not come to them. Pray that your flight will not take place in compromise, in more difficult times than it is, or because your religion locks you into believing something, or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now. Your personal abomination is unparalleled. When our world collapses, it is unequaled from then till now, and it will never be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, there would be no hope. But there is hope, because of those who are the children of God know that the hope will not destroy us. If God is in control of the narrative of human history, he is in control of the narrative of our lives. And the prophetic promise is, if I know the future of the world, I know yours. If I hold the future of humanity in my hands, and I am working all things together for good, I am holding your future in my hands, and I will work all things together for good. On the other side of the summit is the sunrise. Jesus' disciples asked him, how will we know? How will we know when these things are coming to pass? How will we know that this is the sign of your coming, that this is the end of the age? He says, listen to me. You'll know it because there will be signs in the world in which we live, and there will be signs in your own individual experience that are telling you it will get worse before it gets better. It's hard for us to talk about this because it's not what we want to focus on, but it is what we want to focus on. It's classic sci-fi literature. It's this narrative of the oppressive evil empire, or the machines that have gone rogue, or the aliens filled with malice and evil intent to invade our planet, or the wages of our own human self-destructive behavior that are ruining our future. That narrative occurs over and over and over again. And like I said, I'm no expert. I'm no sci-fi expert. I used to like it until Captain Picard and his bald head. So what I did this week is I said, I wonder if that's true. I want to see what people say about the best sci-fi films ever made. So I spent an afternoon reading hundreds of reviews and looking at the lists that film critics have of the top sci-fi movies that have ever been made. And you know what I found? I found that their affections are all over the map. Some like movies I had never heard of, some of them like classics, some of them like these avant-garde films. But after reading through dozens of these film critics' top 100 lists and top 50 lists and top 10 lists since the turn of 2000, I decided I'm going to put together my own list. These are my top sci-fi films, and what I found was that all of them were dystopian. All of my favorite films have the story of it getting worse before it gets better. Let me share with you my top 6. My top 6 sci-fi films of all time. Number 6 was Men in Black 3. I loved Men in Black 3. I liked 1, 2 I could throw away, but 3 was great. You know, and I'm going to ruin it for you, but Will Smith's dad gets killed at the end. And there's a time travel thing, and it's awesome in a kind of way that folds in on each other. And I like Tommy Lee Jones anyway, so Men in Black 3 is a good one. And it's really a story of malicious aliens with evil intent. Number 5 on my list is The Blues Brothers. Now I know what you're thinking. The Blues Brothers is not a sci-fi film. It's my list, my rules. I love the movie The Blues Brothers. Any top film list that I'm making, it's going to be on it. Okay, so deal with it. Number 4 is The Matrix. The first one, The Matrix. I mean, that's machines gone rogue. It's AI out of control. It's that future that we fear, where we are subject to the technology that we actually created, and now it's ruling over us. Plus, I love Keanu Reeves going, "I'm Neo," and that's his best line in the movie. And it's just philosophically good. It's interesting. That's number 4. Number 3 is a tie for me. 2 movies by Christopher Nolan. The first one is Inception, and the second one is Interstellar. And I have to put Interstellar on the list because I think McConaughey is great in that movie. That scene where he cries over his daughter, where he's watching it, just tears me up. And it's a story, basically, of humanity gone mad. And we've destroyed our planet, and we can't survive here anymore. And the only hope for humanity is to abandon the earth and find somewhere else. And that story is very dystopian. Number 2 on my list, Terminator 2. Hasta la vista, baby. I don't even need to say anything. I mean, that it's James Cameron having fun with CGI. You know, that liquid metal Terminator? That was so great. And that was the clip that I showed you at the beginning. That nuclear explosion was part of the apocalypse that sets the end of the world in motion, where the machines now rule over us. And number 1 for me on my top sci-fi movies, Star Wars. The original Star Wars. You know, the first one. And you may be thinking, well, that's not very dystopian. It's cute, it's fun. It's, you know, Han Solo and Luke Skywalker making out with his sister, and you know, Chewbacca like, you know, but it's very dystopian. An evil empire that rules over the galaxy, they have a Death Star, for crying out loud. How would you like to be a little cobbler working in your little shop on Tatooine, and you don't think it's anything? And then, boom, your whole planet is vaporized. That's dark. That's Star Wars. They all have it. It is the voice of a prophet. The voice of a prophet is the voice of honesty that says, it will get worse before it gets better. That's the bad news. The bad news is it will get worse. It will get worse for us as individuals. It will get worse for us as a human race. It will get worse in ways that we cannot comprehend. But the good news is, it will get better. We save the best for last. Next week, the hope beyond the hill, the hope of heaven, the hope of better.